Jewish. On behalf of all these Palestinians, allow me to say thank you very much. Thank you for your efforts to try to obtain some justice for the Palestinian cause. And we are all delighted now to listen to you.
Thank you, first of all, for those very gracious and tender words that mean a lot. And being engaged with the Palestinian issue over a couple of decades now has been, for me, a very enriching experience, touching so many lives of people who I've come to love and appreciate, even as they've suffered unjustly for more than a century. The ordeal of the Palestinian people really stretches back at least to 1917, when the Balfour Declaration was issued. I want to say at the outset that, having probably spoken a couple hundred times to audiences about the Palestinian issue, this is the first time I've ever spoken in a Palestine museum. and that's a meaningful and precious experience for me. And I think of all the favorable impact on public opinion that Jewish museums have had over the last 50 or 70 years, at least since World War II. The Zionist movement has made extremely effective use of the museum framework as a way of disseminating their narrative, which focuses on the experience of the Holocaust and why, because of that experience, no question should be raised about the injustices imposed on the Palestinian people. Mm-hmm. So one should not underestimate the importance of a museum setting for creating a better understanding of the Palestinian narrative, which is the narrative people have to hear and absorb, because the Palestinians are the ones that have endured this subjugation and victimization for nothing wrong that they did. Their innocence has been punished by the Nazi crimes, for which there is no justification. There's a justification for taking account of those crimes, but not by inflicting injustice on another people. And the original sin of Zionism, in my view, was the idea of establishing a Jewish state in a non-Jewish society. That's the original sin, and from that sin has flowed all the abuses that have occurred, because one has to put it in the historical circumstance of the 20th and 21st centuries. The Zionist project is the only example of a colonialist undertaking that succeeded in the face of the decolonial experience. In other words, European colonialism collapsed at the very moment when Israel was established as a settler colonial state. And in some ways, if you look at it in a peculiar way, from at least if you look back at the pre-Nazi period, this was an entirely utopian project that no one thought would ever have a concrete realization. The early Zionists said to one another, "You don't have to be crazy to be a Zionist, but it helps." And it helps because you have to stay committed to something that won't happen. See, and in that sense, Zionism, in terms of the project that it undertook, was a incidental beneficiary of the Nazi experience. It probably never would have culminated in a Jewish state without the sense of horror that the Holocaust generated, and was accentuated by the fact that the liberal democracies did very little, if anything, to help the Jewish people who were victimized in the course of this experience. So it's a very tormented century of suffering that has been inflicted upon the Palestinian people against the tide of history, against the decolonizing tide of history. And part of why I say that all that has followed for the Palestinian people, including the apartheid structure that was mentioned in the introductory words, arises from that original sin. Because if you think about it, when the colonial order was established, there wasn't the active nationalism in the non-Western world. There was a certain passivity that allowed colonial movements, colonial projects to be established with relatively little resistance. But in the post-colonial and decolonizing period, since 1945, there was a rampant or a resurgent nationalism all over the world. And it was a nationalism that quite remarkably neutralized and overcame the military superiority of the colonial powers, which is one of the things that the West, and particularly my country, the US, hasn't learned, that in the late 20th and 21st century, you can't control history by military means alone. But what this has meant for the Palestinian people is that they would not accept a colonial rulership, and so from the very outset was a dynamic of resistance. And from the point of view of the Zionist movement, resistance induced repression, which induced more resistance. So you had this cycle of resistance and repression that intensified and crystallized around these structures of apartheid. And apartheid has been very, the word comes, of course, from the South African experience of racial victimization based on the separation of the races and the exploitation of black Africans by the white settler colonial elite. In the Israeli context, the nature of the apartheid structure has been quite different, because there was a problem that the South Africans didn't face. They established they made no pretension of establishing some kind of democratic political system. They were overtly repressive. And the Zionist project, particularly in its first phases, premised its legitimacy on two aspects. One was providing a sanctuary for the Jewish people, but the second was becoming a progressive democratic state. And how could they become it? How could they be both a Jewish state and a democratic state in a non-Jewish society? And so from that interaction flowed what one can only call ethnocide, or a kind of genocidal imperative, because they had to get rid of a large proportion of the Palestinians in order to have a Jewish democratic state. So the Nakba, as of 1948, although it should be understood not to be an event but a process that continues to the present, but the Nakba was crucial. It was crucial to the Zionist project, because without that expulsion of up to 700,000 or more Palestinians, there could be no pretense of having a democratic state. And without a democratic state, it would have been very difficult for the West to legitimize an explicitly apartheid Israel that kept the Palestinian majority but repressed it, the whole majority. So you had to have you had to have what might be called theater democracy, where you had the forms of democratic procedure and some of the rights associated, particularly for the Jewish people. But you also had to engage in ethnic cleansing, and you have to keep engaging in a certain amount of ethnic cleansing because of the differential fertility rates and other factors that create what Israelis refer to as the demographic bomb. Now, what is the demographic bomb? It's the threat to this Jewish majority. And if you have that threat to the Jewish majority, you have to keep doing some things that make that not happen. And those things are not pleasant things. And so the criminalization of the Israeli political process was bound up with this commitment to being democratic and being Jewish at the same time. Now, with the passage of time, this formula has been slowly eroded and arguably abandoned. For a long time, we kept hearing this terminology, Israel is the only democratic state in the Middle East. You don't hear that very much anymore. And you don't hear it much anymore because Israel has given up, essentially, the challenge of legitimating themselves as a democracy and as a protector of human rights. They now are much more legitimating themselves by being a valuable supplier of arms and counterinsurgency training to a whole bunch of states, as many as 100 states, including some important ones like India and some of the larger African countries. In other words, they have pursued what might be called a Hobbesian view of political legitimacy based on power and control, and not based on, as it was in its early stage, on values and progressive ideas. And the other feature of Zionism that's important to understand, I think, in this sort of assessment is that it has always hidden its real goals. And it's been very effective in projecting an image of relative reasonableness, willingness to compromise, and so on, accepting at the outset, at the time of the Balfour Declaration, the idea of a homeland, not a state. And that was very deliberately avoided by the British Foreign Office, that definitely didn't want to cause trouble for themselves by promising a Jewish state. And what they saw, among other things, was this was the British colonial vision was partly a divide and rule, that they bring Jews there and they create tensions between the rival ethnicities, and that makes their colonial job of administration easier. And they were interested in Palestine after the fall of the Ottoman Empire because that was a valuable link to their big imperial interests in the East, particularly India. So they saw, and the Suez Canal and so on. So it was seen as a strategic link in the British imperial vision. But as soon as that was established, as soon as the homeland and and one should remember that at the time of the Balfour Declaration, the Jewish population of Palestine was somewhere between 5 and 7%. It was a small minority. And the idea of a Jewish state representing 5 to 7% of the population seemed absurd as a political project. It could be an imaginative project of some kind, but to think of it as a political project was really more than utopian or dysutopian. It was outside the range of the rational mentality. But as the situation evolved in Europe and as the Zionist movement gained strength, they first shifted their goals from homeland to state. They made that then a demand, not just a goal, and they reinforced it with the terrorist militias, which were very active, and instead of befriending the British, they became a oppositional force. They wanted the British out so that they could move toward establishing their state, and the British, as they usually do, retreated with this scenario of partition, which they did in many Ireland, India, many places, and always leaving a trail of blood behind them when they do that. I mean, there are other not very good end games for colonialism. The French fought wars the British got out fairly easily and let the native peoples fight the wars. You know, it was a way of shifting the bloodshed of the transition from the colonial power to the native peoples. Let me shift from this these comments about the background of the conflict to saying a few things about the present context, because I think it is a period that is very challenging for Palestinian aspirations of national self-determination and the long-deferred realization of Palestinian rights. And I think there are, at least two main developments adverse to Palestinian aspirations that need to be taken into account. The first of these is the change in the Israeli-American approach to the struggle with the Palestinians. Up until the election of Trump in the United States, the basic American approach was one of what I would call partisanship with Israel. In other words, leaning toward the Israeli side, pretending to be an honest broker or a third-party intermediary, but holding forth the vision of a political compromise. And the political compromise was oriented around the two-state solution, that there would be an independent, sovereign Palestinian state, and this vision was articulated quite often and I think sincerely by the Obama presidency. Naively, but sincerely. In my view, the Israelis increasingly felt no pressure to reach a political compromise, and their more expansionist vision of the Zionist project extended beyond the 67 borders and extended to the so-called Promised Land, which is a kind of biblical reconstruction of ancient Israel and encompasses Jerusalem and the West Bank, which from an international law point of view are occupied territories that do not belong to Israel from any kind of perspective, from any kind of legal moral perspective, particularly in the post-colonial era. So that's an important development, is this territorial expansion of the scope of the Zionist project. See, it's no longer a state. It was, even in 48, it didn't remain confined to the kind of vision of partition that the United Nations issued, which itself was unfair to the Palestinians, very unfair to the Palestinians, and denying of their rights. But after the 48 war, the new conception of the division between Palestine and Israel gave the Israelis 78% of the territory and the Palestinians 22%. And the Palestinians, at least as of the 1988 or so, accepted the idea that they could coexist with Israel, provided they got a sovereign, independent state in this remaining 22% of historic Palestine. And what I think the history of the since then underscores is that Israel really never wanted that, even that kind of favorable allocation. They still held on to this, the Zionist leadership at any rate, held on to this vision that the biblical entitlement was more than the 78%. And they created the settlement movement, which was a way of signaling an unacceptable, that the 67 borders were basically not acceptable to Israel, even though it gave them 78%. And they further consolidated and claimed Jerusalem as the unified city, the indivisible unified city, expanded boundaries of Israel. And so that pretty much signaled an unwillingness to reach a political compromise, at least a reasonable political compromise. And what had been called the peace process, at best, was seeking a new ceasefire. It was not a sustainable peace, because the Palestinian people would not, over time, accept such an unjust kind of arrangement. So the whole concept of the two-state solution was flawed, in my view, for many years, not just since the Trump presidency. But what the Trump presidency has done is to shift from this partisanship to what has been called by one of the sort of Zionist ideologues, Daniel Pipes, a victory scenario. And what he argues, and what the Kushner-led Trump deal of the century entails, is as I say, a shift from partisanship to Israeli victory. And Palestinian, a coercive approach to make the Palestinians understand that they've lost the political struggle, and the best they can hope for is, quote unquote, an economic peace. And what does an economic peace mean? It means that there's a kind of promise that the daily lives of the Palestinian people will be materially improved, but that they will be subject to the discipline and repression associated with the apartheid structures that have been established not only for within territorial Israel, but indirectly through the mechanisms of ethnic displacement, the refugee camps throughout the region, and the involuntary exiles, the Palestinian diaspora that denies Palestinians a right to return to their place of preferred residence. So what is at stake here is the degree to which this cruel policy that tries to convince the Palestinian people that they've lost the struggle, which according to Pipes and what Trump has actually done involves making the coercive dimensions of the apartheid structure more cruel and repressive and communicating an unambiguous message. So that what has happened, which probably is familiar to many of you, is the movement of the American embassy to Jerusalem, the withdrawal of funding for the relief and educational activities of the UN agencies that were creating at least minimally bearable conditions in Gaza and in the refugee camps, the endorsement of Israeli territorial claims to the Golan Heights, which is of course part of Syria, and the acceleration, approval of the accelerated settlement arrangements in Jerusalem and the West Bank. So all of these developments are part, I think, of a coherent strategy of twisting the Palestinian arm to the point where they give up. And it's, as I say, it's a cruel policy that seems destined to fail. And part of why it's destined to fail is that the Palestinian will to resist is still very robust and exhibited persistence and courage in this great march of return over the last 14 months or so, in which essentially non-violent Palestinians were confronted by excessive weekly Israeli uses of force that killed hundreds of people and many of them unarmed, most of them unarmed, and wounded thousands. And yet the Palestinians kept coming back week after week to the Gaza border. It was one of the most dramatic and underreported acts of nonviolent resistance in modern times, and yet below the radar, which is part of the issue, part of the difficulty of how do you create a sufficient understanding of what is happening. The other important adverse development from a Palestinian point of view is the defection of the Arab governments in the region. The Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Bahrain in particular, and to some extent and the UAE, United Arab Emirates, are all seeking to encourage the Palestinians to accept this economic peace. And they've been themselves induced to do this, even though they know their people are opposed. Their populations are still in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. But the elites that run these countries see two things that lead them to take this unpopular domestic position. One of them is that they give priority to the confrontation with Iran, and the way of getting the American geopolitical muscle behind that confrontation is to give way on Israel-Palestine. And the other reason is they need the American support in order to stabilize their own regimes. So that this development is a very, these two things are very unfortunate. But let me say a few things in bringing my remarks to a close, which are what I would call glimmers of light in this dark sky. The first of these glimmers of light is a clarification of what the real situation is. There's no longer this illusion that the two-state solution is a viable outcome. And there's an increasing recognition, I think, by people who are looking at this, at the realities of the situation, is that the only sustainable peace without apartheid would be a single secular democratic state. That's the only thing that will work at this point. And understanding that, even though governments are reluctant to accept it, because when you accept it, you're basically saying Zionism is dead as far as a political project to control the state is concerned. And particularly the Western states have been very reluctant to say that. But I think also a second clarification is this acknowledgement that Israeli security rests on an apartheid structure. See, that was said rhetorically in the past, but I think in the last 5 years or so, it's now been established in a responsible way that this is an apartheid structure, that there is a systematic way of dominating a people based on its ethnic characteristics for the sake of maintaining a structure of ethnic domination. And Israel itself, through its basic law of 2018, has more or less endorsed this vision by saying only the Jewish people have a right of self-determination and of eliminating Arabic as a official language of Israel. So it's almost, without using the words, acknowledging the nature of the non-democratic Israeli apartheid state. You can't have a state where, you can't have a legitimate democratic state that denies rights to 20% of its own population if you just consider Israel as a territorial entity rather than in relation to the refugees and diaspora, Palestinian diaspora. So that this clarification, I think, is important because it has the effect of delegitimizing Israel as a state among states. The second development that I think is important is the growth of the global solidarity movement that is premised on the idea that only civil society can really challenge the Israeli way of dominating the Palestinian people. And it's instructive to recognize that that's what happened in relation to South African apartheid too. It was challenged by the earlier version of the BDS campaign and by the anti-apartheid campaign that was globally endorsed by the United Nations and by excluding South Africa from athletic events and cultural activity. And that's happening increasingly in relation to Israel. So there is a growing global solidarity movement, and these solidarity movements have the capacity, given other developments, to change the balance of forces. And that's what I meant earlier when I suggested that military superiority is no longer a guarantee of political outcomes. The great lesson that should have been learned by the US in Vietnam was that you can dominate the battlefield and lose the war. See, and that is a very important change. And to understand why that change has to do with this perseverance and courage and strength of national resistance movements. So this combination of national resistance and global solidarity really can alter the balance of forces within a struggling society. And what has also become clear, I believe, in this period is that UN can't solve the Palestinian problem. The intergovernmental process, the diplomacy of the Oslo framework failed. So the civil society has the responsibility and the opportunity to play a decisive historical role. And it's that role, that potentiality, that is the ground, I think, of hope for Palestinian empowerment and eventual liberation. And I think these developments are extremely important. And the third and final element that I would point to is the prospect of a second Arab Spring. The turn in the Arab world against the Palestinian struggle is reversible. And the developments of recent months in Algeria, Sudan, and in Libya suggest that there's still a level of disaffection, mass disaffection, and it's only through coercion that Egypt is kept under the dictatorial control of the Sisi government, or the Saudis keep control over their own populations. So these situations could explode at any point with radical implications for the regional balance of power. And finally, in this context, the global balance is also unstable. We hope at least that Trump will not be re-elected, and some of the candidates that want to become president recognize, some of the Democratic alternatives to Trump recognize the unfairness and destructiveness of how Trump has dealt with the Palestinian issue. It would mean a return to a kind of Israel-leaning partisanship, but it will not be a continuation of the Pipes type of victory caucus geopolitics. So with those kind of glimmers of light, let me stop and welcome your questions, and thank you for your patience.
Wow, so if we have any questions, please put your hands up now. And we'll take one at a time. Sven, first of all.
All right.
It's on.
I can speak very loudly as well.
Can you?
Hold it up.
Yeah, all right. Forgive me if I ask a slightly loaded question, but it's something that I've been struggling with myself. I'd like to know your views on BDS. As someone that's viewed the conflict or the situation in Israel and Palestine through a lens of human rights and international humanitarian law, what would you say to someone who would argue that BDS is in itself a form of collective punishment towards Israelis who are there just by kind of being born there, who aren't taking a part in the occupation or the oppression of the Palestinian people?
Well, I think it's an important question, of course, and I think one needs to understand that BDS is essentially a exercise of nonviolent freedom of expression and what the rights of citizens in a democratic society should entail. And that the fact that there are adverse effects on some third parties is something that is always present in oppositional political activity. And it was used to be said in relation to South Africa that these techniques were hurting the African population more than the white dominant population. And it was said in relation to Pinochet's Chile that you weren't hurting the dictatorship, you were hurting the ordinary people. But if you consult those that are being victimized, they don't respond that way. They welcome these demonstrations of solidarity. And my own experience of the BDS campaign against South Africa was that it was an experience mainly in the American context, was that there were many people in the political leadership of the country, or even at the political leadership of my university, that disapproved of BDS and thought it was either foolish or ineffective or hurt the wrong people, but no one attempted to say that it was an improper tactic or an illegal or criminal undertaking. That was never said, and people were said to, as I say, to have been imprudent, but no one raised the question of whether it was wrong. And it was at the very time when the civil rights movement was going on in the U.S. dealing with racism and so on. So that this effort by Zionism to stigmatize the BDS campaign and to connect it somehow to anti-Semitism is a very destructive tactic that it's a scandal that responsible leaders in the Western world give it a certain level of credibility. And one hopes that it will not be taken seriously, although there's a heavily subsidized Israeli campaign to stigmatize and, if possible, criminalize participation in BDS and to exclude PDS activists from coming to Israel or Palestine.
Hi, I want to make a couple of points. I mean, first of all, that the whole kind of, concept of what's happened there, actually arose in 1917 with the colonial powers, and it was very much about the route to India and also with the oil and the then discovery of oil. So, you know, we're always kind of being told that somehow it's to do with the Holocaust, but actually, in a way, the Holocaust became an opportunity for those powers to, you know, put in their own sort of client, create their own client state. I don't know if you'd agree with that, or would think I'm overstating. The other thing I wanted to say was that we've recently had Ilan Pepe in Bristol, and he's talking about and promoting the one-state solution, which seems to be slowly gathering some support within Israel. And also, I mean, I've heard, I don't know how true it is, that a lot of people are actually leaving Israel because they don't like the direction it's going. I mean, I heard something like 1 million people left last year. 1 million, Jewish Israelis left because they don't like the way the direction it's taking. So I don't want to comment on that.
If I understood your 2 points accurately, the motivations surrounding the Balfour Declaration definitely were colonialist in their, at least partially colonialist in their nature. There was also this idea that by endorsing a Jewish homeland, one would induce Jews to leave Britain. So it was a kind of mixture that you find now with evangelical Christians, a mixture of anti-Semitism and fanatical support for Zionism. It's a very strange mix. I mean, it comes in the Christian Zionist form. It comes out of this reading of the book of Revelations and the idea that Jesus will return when Jews go back to Israel, Palestine, and face a final judgment. And most of them would be damned once Jesus returns and decides, unless they convert to Christianity. And I think you're right to mention that 3-letter word, oil, that has been has underpinned the geopolitics of the region, and deformed and distorted it, and for a long time, I think, was the foundation of this special relationship between the U.S. and Israel, which was a contested relationship in the early period, because the part of the U.S. government felt oil was more important than solidarity with Israel, and you couldn't have both. So there was a tension, and when that tension was overcome was the 1967 war, because then suddenly they thought, we don't have to protect Israel. Israel can now protect our interests in the region because of their unexpectedly formidable military capabilities. So that 67 war really changed, and it changed a lot of diaspora Jews from a kind of neutrality or indifference toward Israel to suddenly having pride in this little Prussian presence in the Middle East. And I saw it very much close at hand among Jewish communities in the United States, suddenly feeling proud, and there are many people, many Jewish people that feel that the Hitler experience taught them that weakness and passivity lead to tragedy, whereas strength and domination lead to good things. And so that's been a very important element. As far as Jews leaving Israel, that has been going on, and so I've been told that 80% of the Jewish population of Israel have 2 passports, and they have, they have an escape path of potential escape. And I was on a TV panel a couple of years ago with a kind of prominent former sort of left-leaning Zionist who took the position, Israel isn't the country it used to be. And that, from his point of view, a sort of liberal progressive Zionist point of view, the early Israel was idealistic and had this vision of making the desert bloom and dancing through the night, and all of that early romanticism around the Israeli establishment of Israel. All of that has been displaced by a kind of cynical consumerism and materialism. See, and one of the things that I didn't mention, which I think is important, is that the Israeli internal politics has shifted more and more to the right. And in this last election and in the forthcoming rerun of the last election, Palestine wasn't in the wasn't discussed, wasn't a controversial issue, wasn't a prominent issue, because the leading candidates all agreed. So they all endorsed the maximal Zionist project. And so there's no peace camp that's politically relevant within Israeli politics at this point. And that's another aspect of clarifying. If you're waiting for the peace camp to deliver peace is like waiting for Godot. It's not going to happen. Or at least it won't happen until this balance of forces changes. So I think you're right, and that notion of Jews leaving Israel, of course, accentuates the anxiety about the demographic bomb. There is this fear that they will be forced into an explicit kind of authoritarianism that denies Palestinians even the nominal rights of voting. So.
Just a second, Ron, any question?
Well, it's not a question, it's more a comment. First of all, I want to express my appreciation for a very lucid historical overview and a very astute political analysis. And I really particularly found your remarks about the glimmer of hope very encouraging, because very often we hear people who give talks about Palestine and Israel always end with a very negative note. That's the emphasis, basically, and that's understandable, but I think you gave us some reason to be hopeful about a peaceful and just resolution of the conflict. But I wanted to add, I think, a very important development, which I think needs mentioning. And that's the growing movement among secular Jews in the United States, in this country, particularly among younger secular Jews, to distance themselves from Israel, if not even developing an anti-Zionist analysis. And there are even some very ardent Zionists who have gone through an epiphany, who now have distanced themselves from the state of Israel. These are rabbis in the United States, or people who actually lived on kibbutzes, who come back basically and say, no, Israel basically, as you said, basically was born in original sin. And I think that's a source of inspiration, because Israel has claimed that they speak for Jews all around the world. And as more and more secular Jews speak up and say, that's nonsense, you do not. In fact, there's a clear distinction between Judaism and Zionism. I think it's a very healthy development, and I think that could be politically very important.
I'm very glad and grateful to you for making that comment, and I agree with it completely. I would recommend to people that don't know about it a recent book called by an American sociologist named Andrew Ross, called Stone Men, the Palestinians Who Built Israel. And it's a kind of semi-autobiographical story, because he, as a young man, illustrated your comments, because he's a Jew who went to work at a kibbutz and found it a good experience. But then the more he got to know what was entailed by the Zionist project, he became increasingly alienated, and now represents exactly the point of view that you were mentioning. And it's true, a fairly large number of influential rabbis and people that have been very closely identified with leadership roles in the Jewish community, and younger Jews definitely have shifted away from any kind of emotional attachment to Israel or Zionism. And I've noticed in speaking in American academic audiences or university settings that those who hold Zionist views no longer pose substantive questions. They recognize that they've lost the argument on substance, and so and it goes back to this anti-BDS movement. They seek to wound the messenger to avoid the message. And it's a tactic that has a lot of money behind it, but is also very discrediting in its nature, I think, hopefully.
I don't know whether it's an area which you have a view on, about the current link between political parties that oppose Labour, the right side wing of the Labour Party, and the pro-Israeli lobby, that are creating this notion that the Labour Party is anti-Semitic, maybe not only to discredit socialism, but also to stop the policies that the Labour Party has, which I think is the fairest policy that any political party has had on the Middle East for a long time. I think this is dangerous for the Jewish population, because firstly it trivializes anti-Semitism, and secondly it makes people have the notion of Jewish control, whereas I think certain Jews, not all, have jumped onto the bandwagon of people who don't like socialism. But it gives the impression of Jewish control because they're using the notion of anti-Semitism. So I think that has a danger for Jewish populations in UK and maybe worldwide. What is your view on this sort of like current movement to discredit political parties through using anti-Semitism in order to improve Israeli chances of continuing its policies that you've described?
No, it's a very well stated and important question, and I agree with how you see it. I share that understanding of the issues. I don't like I don't want to be one of these Americans that goes around and tells people what's going on in their own country. We do too much of that. But I happen to, I think the last time, or maybe the time before I was here in Britain, I shared a platform at a Palestinian meeting with Jeremy Corbyn, and had the pleasure of having dinner with him afterwards, and I'm convinced that it's a scandalous kind of effort by the Blairites to discredit a very decent, honorable, genuine person who really cares about the Palestinian issue and cares generally about injustices that have been done to oppressed peoples. So I think it's brought out the worst in British politics. So I've violated my own rule. But you tempted me too much.
Right, okay, one more quick piece. You have a question?
Yeah, hiya, thanks for coming to Bristol. Appreciate that, and thanks for your talk.
You have to talk louder.
Sorry, thank you for coming to
Come
Bristol.
closer. Come.
Thank you for coming to Bristol. Thanks for your talk. I like your idea. Part of me that likes your idea of a one-state solution, but I've been supporting the Palestinian people for a long time now. What if they don't want a one-state solution? What if they want their own state and to be separate from Israel or the Jewish people or whatever you like to call it?
Yeah, that's a very fair comment, and I've often made it myself until recently. I mean, until recently, I've always said it's up to the Palestinians and to some degree the Israelis to decide what a sustainable peace would be for both peoples. And you can't roll back history. You have to create some way that these two peoples can coexist. But through what Israel has been doing, it's made that alternative of separate states seem not tenable from a Palestinian perspective, so that to avoid suggesting that the events, the so-called facts on the ground that have been deliberately generated for now, I guess almost 50 years by Israel, and has created a situation where even very strong advocates of the two-state solution within Israel itself, someone like Jeff Halper that some of you may know, who he shifted himself to saying it's no longer a serious option, so that the only way that you can understand a sustainable peace occurring and allowing at least the people that are there to coexist is through this single secular state that treats everyone equally and is premised on a human rights foundation. And that's the only thing that I think can work. Now, if the Palestinians for some reason don't want that, or would rather be part of a Arab federation or something, there may be other solutions, other conceptions that haven't yet surfaced in the political imagination. And if that happens, then of course the Palestinians should be guardians of their own rights. And people like myself and non-Palestinians should respect and celebrate that.
So we have one, Alistair has one more quick question, I think.
It's more a comment on this previous question and what you suggest. There are more conceptions on solution. It doesn't need to be two-state, it doesn't need to be one state. There is now a conception suggested by a group of Palestinian, there's a Professor Said Zidani, we had him here as a speaker, and they had this conception about two states in one state. The political separation doesn't mean demographic or geographic separation. Maybe you are aware about this conception. And I, as Palestinian, find it is very much convincing for everyone who wants justice. Because I can be, as Palestinian, I can live in my village in district of Safed, but still I am Palestinian citizen. I belong to the state of Palestine. So I wanted to say there's always, it's flexible. But what we need is that Israeli come to the table and say, okay, we want to do that.
Yeah, yes, as I said, I'm glad you made these remarks. I think the important challenge of that kind of vision is how do you ensure equality? See, because without equality in the treatment of the two peoples or the two states within a state, you will get a situation again that's not a sustainable peace, but will generate opposition, resistance, claims of injustice, and therefore will be a ceasefire, not a peace. So maybe it's too simplistic to put it this way, but I think the challenge to people of goodwill, and especially to Palestinians and to some degree peace-minded Israelis, of which there are not very many these days, that the challenge is to ensure that there is equality. Because if there's not a spirit of equality and the realization of equality, there will not be a sustainable peace. And then you'll have all the disillusionment and the recurrence of violence and disappointment and sadness. So I think it's very important to think through how you establish equality, and it has to come in a way from the heart as well as the brain. And it would have to come from the Israeli heart. See, and again, it's instructive to see what's happened in South Africa with with the transformation that no one expected. I was in South Africa not long before Mandela was released from prison, and I was there as an official observer of a political trial, and I met lots of South African Afrikaners, Winnie Mandela, and lots of people that were involved in one way or another with the either for or against the regime. And one thing they all agreed upon was what happened would never happen. They all felt that the future would be either a continuation of this apartheid structure or a bloody war. And what they didn't anticipate was that a changed relation of forces, not military, but of political and moral forces, altered the calculation of self-interest on the part of the dominant Afrikaner elite. And they decided, after all, they'd be better off getting rid of apartheid than fighting to keep it and being isolated and a pariah state in the world. And that could happen to Israel. It almost did happen in one period, in that period before the 67 war. I think of the 67 war as a very important question.
Okay.
Thank you for your questions. They were really good.
for answering.
Okay, thank you very much.